All right, so we're about halfway done with our backend. Our users can be created and log in. What we want to start doing now is adding the idea of a message for each individual user. So what we're going to do is create a message model. And I've already made a message.js inside of here. If you don't have that, that's totally fine. Just go make one. We're going to bring in Mongoose. We've seen this before. We're going to require Mongoose. But this time we are also going to bring in our user model. Well, you might be wondering, why are we bringing in our user model? That is because we want to make every message have a reference to the user who created it. We're also going to go back in our user model and add a property that refers to all of the messages for that specific user. But let's start with a message first. This schema is going to be a little bit shorter. This is a message schema, and that is a new Mongoose schema. This is an object right here with all of our fields. We're going to have, really simply, just some text. This is going to be a type of a string. We're going to make sure that it's required, though. We don't want any empty messages. And let's give this a max length of, we're going to be fancy, will be 160 characters. We then want to make a reference to every user for that message. We could call this whatever we'd like, but I'm going to be calling it user. And it is a type of a Mongoose schema types object ID. This is specifically just an object ID, or the unique identifier for some user. But what's really important here is that it is a reference to the user model. You might be wondering, well, what happens if you just put a lowercase u or call this something else? Everything's actually going to break. This capital user right here is exactly what we named our model. You have to make sure those match up, otherwise you're going to have a whole bunch of issues. What else do we want inside of here? Well, we're going to make a message that's going to be a Mongoose model called a message, and we'll pass in our message schema, and then we'll make sure that we export out our message. So if we save that, that should work out well. Let's head over to my server. And you might have seen this already, but actually use Mongo client is no longer necessary in Mongoose 5 and up. Please remove it. So if you're not using Mongoose 5 and up, you will actually have to put in that use Mongo client. This is something that's actually relatively new. So inside of my index.js, I'm actually going to take this part out. This is something that I've been doing previously, but Mongoose 5 has now not needed it anymore. So I can quickly restart the server, and here's what I have right here. So if you saw that error message, if you're using Mongoose 4 and under, just make sure you have this use Mongo client of true. That's something I've been doing for a while, but Mongoose has changed, so we don't need that anymore. That should just remove a nice little warning in the server. So what I want to do next, back in our message schema, is think about the relationship between messages and users. So in my user model, I want to make sure that every user has a reference to all of its messages. And instead of this just being an object, this is actually going to be an array. It's going to be an array of object IDs. Once again, we're going to add that type, Mongoose schema types object ID, and a ref to message. Now, you might be wondering here, well, wait a minute, how come we don't have to pass in message right here? And the answer is actually because it is all being exported for us right here. We'll bring in our message and pass in message. By exporting these out all together, the message model is able to be accessed by the user, but we have to pass in that user to the message model. So if we save this, we should be able to start creating messages, but there is something that's pretty important when we create these messages. What I want to think about is what happens when we delete a message. When we delete a message, we don't just want to remove that specific message. We also have to go to the user's messages list or array and remove that specific ID. So just to review, we've made a list of messages for every user that refers to an individual message ID. And for each message, we have a user that it refers to. But we need to add one more thing inside of our schema. We are going to add a pre-remove hook. And this is going to be, once again, another async function that accepts next. And what is the purpose of this remove hook? Well, we need to find a user. We need to remove the ID of the message from their messages list. And then we need to save that user and return next. So this is important because we don't want a situation where we delete a message, but a user still has that ID of the message. That could break things in our API. So we are going to first find a user, but remember, we're dealing with an async function, so we have to wrap everything with a try catch. could call this E or error or whatever you'd like. I'm just keeping it real simple. So we need to find a user. How do we find a user? Well, we'll make some variable for that. Call that user. That's the result of user.findById this.userId. And this refers to the specific document. If you'd like to try to make this an arrow function, things are actually going to break because we do need the correct value of the keyword this. We don't want something outside. So I'm just keeping it simple using the function keyword. Next thing we want to do is remove that ID from the list. And this is done using the remove method. This is a Mongoose method that is completely synchronous. This is just like splicing a specific value from a list. We then want to save that user, so we can await saving of that user, and then return next. And if anything goes wrong at this entire time, you've seen this before, we'll return next with that error. And this is going to be important because when we create our messages, we want to make sure that we populate the list of messages for that user. And when we remove a message, we want to make sure that is removed from the user's list. We'll see this in action when we start actually creating some messages. Let's do that in the next screencast.